back to Green Grand Rapids, the best podcast in Grand Rapids on matters of climate justice.
There we go. That's a good one.
There we go. Yeah, welcome back. We are here with Jeff Smith. He is a local organizer in Grand Rapids. He has a book. What was it? History of Grand Rapids.
People's History.
Oh, the People's History. Excuse me. And yeah, so we are really excited to have you here today with us. Nancy and I personally have met Jeff through some work through Reinform Collective. He's assisting us in some media coverage there. And so yeah, Jeff, go ahead. Give us a little bit.
How do you introduce yourself? 'Cause,
yeah.
I mean, we just threw a bunch of labels onto your person, but how do you identify yourself?
Yeah, well, I'm grateful to be on the show today with you.
Yeah.
I grew up in Pennsylvania, but I've lived in Grand Rapids for most of my life, so I consider this to be my home.
Okay.
I have a history of doing organizing work, probably 40 plus years in this community and around a variety of issues. I was formerly studying to be a Catholic priest, so I went to Aquinas College, but I never finished and got a degree from that. I lived in a housing collective for 25 years with a bunch of other people. We were a sanctuary for Central American political refugees. We also did what we called radical hospitality, which was providing safe space for people who needed housing for one day or for 6 months or however long they needed.
Yeah.
And we tried to practice what we called then simple living, what people would refer to as sustainability now. We grew a lot of our own food. We had a greenhouse that we built from dumpster materials. We
Nice.
mostly got around by bike. We heated the house with dumpster wood. We, would can. We'd save seeds. We mostly got around by bicycle.
Yeah.
So we tried to practice our simple life. So
I love that.
but since then I've also just been doing a lot of education work. I used to work at the Community Media Center and was the director of what was called the Grand Rapids Institute for Information Democracy, GRID, and which was mostly media literacy, critical thinking about media. And then I also started a second blog in 2010 called the Grand Rapids People's History Project, which was to try to document history from below, from marginalized communities, from social justice movements, all those kinds of things. So that's more or less me in a nutshell, I guess.
Yeah, but we were just talking about how we live many lives, right? That is literally in a nutshell.
Yeah.
There's just no way that, that can be conceptualized. And that's so many years of very dedicated work. So it's super cool, I think, just to have you in this room. I've learned a lot from, just grasping what kind of organizing techniques you use and, just how you can use, I guess, like showcasing what makes us human as a tool toward getting where we want to be within these like very human issues.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited to have more of a conversation about kind of how your work is intersecting with our work coming up.
Well, I'll ask a question for our listeners who may not know what media literacy is. How would you define that?
I would define it as critical thinking about media and all media, not just news, but any kind of media that's produced, films,
books,
and video games,
social media,
whatever,
etc.
right? Anything, absolutely, just critical thinking about it. I mean, there are sort of people in the media literacy field would say that there are sort of 7 major principles of media literacy, which I don't think we need to sort of necessarily define, but the one I think is the most critical, the most important, is this idea that all media is constructed. It's all made.
Yeah, okay.
We don't get information that comes to us with a 360-degree lens, right?
Yeah, so
somebody
all of it
produces the
has an
media.
implicit bias, basically.
Right. Somebody produces it. It's constructed. It's not just what actually happened. It's they put it together. And that's not a good or bad thing. It just is, right? But I think it's important that we come to terms with that fact because more often than not, much of what we are given is determined by, economic influences, political biases, all those kinds of things that determine what people read, what they watch, what they listen to. And more often than not, that's driven by profits, right?
Yeah.
Because we predominantly have a commercial media system in this country, unlike in other places where there's at least dedicated public funds for more public kinds of independent media.
Yeah. So even just like thinking about the fact that it is all constructed and it's constructed by like a person most usually, like that means it's also probably like incomplete a lot of times too, right? So
Absolutely.
yeah, important to keep in
I
mind.
call it the human error.
Yeah.
We are all
because we're not
subjected to it.
omniscient.
Yeah.
Right, right. I mean, so there's always, and that person has been influenced by, there's external forces, whether it's editors or producers or other people, advertisers, depending on what kind of media you're making, could influence. And it's not necessarily always heavy-handed. People just might be aware that what I might want to say might not fly with my editors or the people who pay the bills or whatever kinds of things, right? And then I think the other component is with individuals who make media is that we've all internalized certain values, right, and beliefs that can impact and influence how we see the world, right? So, if somebody who believes that the United States is the most amazing democracy on the planet, then I've internalized the values that I don't see it as a country that was founded on genocide and slavery,
Right.
or I don't see it as an imperialist power, those kinds of things.
You
Right?
almost
We've internalized
can't.
those, right?
Yeah.
So, and that obviously is influenced by not just the media we consume, but the education systems that we go through, which obviously
Yeah.
don't teach a critical view of, more often than not, a critical view of U.S. history. So.
I learned
Totally.
U.S. history as an adult.
Yeah,
And I learned it
same.
from conversations with people, from looking into things myself, from being like, why are things this way? It's, to your point, it's really a critical analysis of even the education that you've received. And, we can get down a rabbit hole with that one. It's a pretty big hole. So I guess, how did you then get into organizing? So you kind of gave like a general overview and what I would consider organizing, right? Like, because there are different layers to being an organizer. But like, how would you say you got to this point where it became like the social stuff, like reporting on social stuff, or needing to have like a different lens than what mainstream is giving us?
How'd you get radicalized, basically?
Yeah.
Where, when, how, why,
Yeah,
all of it.
It's kind of a series of
Course.
events and interactions that I had that I think, and I like to believe that I'm continuing to be radicalized up until this very day, that I'm not.
The journey
I'm
never
not-
ends. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Sort
It
of
didn't
kind
just
of-
happen one day and then you're good.
Bam.
Right,
Before
yeah.
and after.
So I think probably, when we were talking earlier, I think I mentioned that and this was mostly because of my brother, who got involved with sort of what's called the Catholic worker movement within the Catholic Church, which again is people who were anti-war, who would, run housing, shelters or soup kitchens or all those kinds of things, right? So it's a different kind of view than what the kind of the mainstream church sort of practices. And so I was around him and those people, and that was kind of the beginning of like getting me to kind of tilt my head a little bit and think like, maybe the world is not what I thought it was or whatever.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. And then at the time I was working for Myers in the warehouse in Lansing, and I quit my job and I went to teach in a barrio school in Puerto Rico for a year
Just like that.
without getting paid. I had no like prior like educational background,
That's a leap.
but the school was like desperate for male teachers because they didn't have any. And I also was the bus driver, the coach, the gym teacher, a whole bunch of things besides being. And so I was, I was 21, and I was like, I needed to do something to kind of rattle my world a bit, right? And and immerse myself in a totally different culture. And it did just that, right? I learned a ton while I was there about myself and about the world and how Puerto Ricans viewed the United States and all that sort of stuff, right? Plus, just the Puerto Rican culture was just incredible, right? I had students who would come to school every morning. I only had 13 students. It was a small school, right? I taught 7th grade. And the students would greet each other by hugging and kissing each other. It was just what you did, right? It wasn't anything unusual. It's just that was just part of Puerto Rican culture. People greet each other with,
the hug.
The parents would show up. If the parents dropped them off or accompanied them to the school, they would give me a kiss. And initially it was like, what the hell's going on? It's totally out of my experience.
It's like, these moms all love me.
My German, very rigid, cold sort of culture, right?
Yeah, we don't even hug our friends, you know?
Sort of thing. So that was really liberating, right? That people were interacted that way with each other. So then it became just part of who I was. So I sort of adopted this way of greeting people, right? Which was very lovely. So I came back, and that's when I moved to Grand Rapids. So this is 1982. In fact, I used to work right next door to this building, which was St. James Catholic Church, which I'm not even sure they're operating as a church anymore. But
a lot of your life has formed around this space for a while.
So there used to be, where the parking lot is down here, there used to be 3 houses, and I lived in the middle house. So I was the youth pastor at St. James Catholic Church, right? Because I had just come from working with,
it's the students,
seventh graders, right? And I felt like I had a really good rapport with them, and so I wanted to do something that was youth work based, right? So I got this job here, and again, I got free room and board, but I wasn't getting paid because I was like, I don't care. I'm just, I'm young. I'm a bit naive. I'm an idealist. I'm like, as long as I have my needs taken care of, I don't care.
Yeah.
So and then I met people in the congregation, and this is 82, and of course the U.S. government is obsessing over what's happening in Central America because the Sandinistas had their revolution in Nicaragua in 1979 and overthrew a decades-long dictatorship that the U.S. had supported for a long time. And then the U.S. was also funding the counterinsurgency wars in El Salvador and Guatemala, and they had turned Honduras into essentially a large U.S. military base at the time. So the U.S. had just like a massive presence within Central America in the 1980s during the Reagan years. Right?
As we do.
Right. So
that's embarrassing.
There were 2 Catholic priests who had just come back from Nicaragua. And the guy who was the head of the Peace and Justice Committee set up a little soup and bread kind of evening, which was, it's typical within the Catholic worker to have what they call evenings of clarification, which was you have a simple meal, and then somebody talks about a topic, and then you have a conversation. So we heard from firsthand from these 2 Catholic priests what was going on and in Nicaragua, and it was incredible. Well, the person who put it on, and because I was present, even though I, as the youth pastor, had nothing to do with organizing the event, the priest who ran St. James called us into his office and reprimanded us for being a part of this event, right? And we're like, well, why? And he says, well, the priests in Nicaragua are involved in the government, and they do the whole liberation theology thing, and we don't really appreciate that. They don't really obey.
They're like, we love colonizing.
We don't obey the Vatican, blah blah blah, kind of thing. So then he, and this was, so I was doing all this work with the students. I was coaching basketball and softball, and as well as just doing all the youth pastor stuff with the students,
driving the bus,
right? All those kinds of things, right? Which was great. I did playground duty at St. James School, all that kind of stuff. I just loved hanging out with the kids, right?
Yeah.
And so the school year ends, summer camp happens, and I spend a week long at this Catholic youth camp, right? Which there were a bunch of folks from the parish who went, high school students who went. So, and I was one of the camp counselors, right? Great experience, again. Come back from that, and the priest invited a person from Ann Arbor to come and speak about what was happening in Nicaragua. And he didn't come and just speak at a forum. He gave him his space during this to give the sermon, which was, and he was basically saying that the Sandinistas were communists, they're killing innocent people,
Yeah.
blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Of course, none of it was true.
The
But
platform was given
people
to the
weren't
preferred
investigating
narrative.
or didn't.
Yeah.
You know, if they were just relying on again the U.S. news media, they'd be like, "Oh yeah, that tracks.
Yeah,
That's
right.
what's happening." So we
And as someone who
we
like grew up in church culture, I know sometimes like challenging what somebody at the pulpit says can be seen as like blasphemous almost. So I can see why nobody even like questioned that.
Yeah. So, but me and this other guy had sort of confronted the person afterwards and found out that he was a part of this kind of expatriate, Nicaraguan, Somosan dictatorship kind of government, right? Who was actively working with lots of other U.S. people, particularly far right element of the Catholic Church, like Thomas Monahan, the founder of Domino's Pizza, right? He was a part of this right-wing Catholic group that was trying to do whatever they could to undermine the Sandinista revolution, right?
What?
And lobbying.
He owns
It's like,
Domino's.
Domino's
I know it's
Pizza,
like
right?
let's connect Domino's Pizza to fascism. That's what I'm writing down.
Oh
in
my
my
goodness,
notes.
Yeah.
no, but that speaks. It rings very true to a lot of like. You're kind of like, why are these people just like inherently bad? Why are corporations just wild? And then
Yeah.
you say things like that, and like we sometimes forget that like they're rooted in specific values, and that could have largely determine whether or not they're gonna care about people in another way as well.
Yeah.
Or like just like the fact that because we are just because of the life that we lead here in America, like our hands are like inherently like filled with blood or covered in blood because everything that brings us comfort or convenience
For sure.
came at a price.
For sure.
Sorry,
So
Sorry to derail.
Yeah,
but,
no.
That's what we do.
I appreciate the additional words and affirmation around that reality, right? Is just that. So I just come back from this summer camp and I was not in the door, 15 minutes, and the priest comes over and tells me that he wants me to go to Ann Arbor next week to spend a week with this far right Catholic group,
Right.
so that I can get my mind right. This is sort of his take on the whole thing. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm here to minister to these youth, right? That's my job, is to work with these young folks, and many of them in the summer don't have a whole lot of things to do.
Right.
So I'm going to spend time with the folks who are maybe most vulnerable and figure out ways to kind of keep them safe and, all that good stuff, And he's like, well, I can't have anybody who works for me not obey what I tell them to do. And I said, well, I'm just not changing my mind. I'm not going. I don't see the point of that. I don't see how that's going to make me a better youth pastor. And he said, well, if that's the case, then get your shit and get out now. Like that.
We like cursing here. It's okay.
I had to get out that day. He kicked me out, right?
Yikes.
So
Humanity.
fortunately,
right?
I knew people who gave me a place to stay temporarily. And then, by the end of the summer, I entered the seminary and went to live at the seminary house on Aquinas' campus, whatever, right? So that whole process was, again, kind of a very radicalizing experience that sort of opened my eyes about, like, okay, I didn't recognize or realize that there are systems of power in place that will do whatever they can to prevent people from like knowing the truth or questioning the truth, questioning reality or whatever kinds of things. So that was another like pivotal moment for me, right?
So I guess what just popped in my head is you can plant seeds, but they have to be these ones, right? Like we don't want you talking about things outside of what we want people to grow.
As in, that's what the
around.
church was saying. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what the church was saying. Is you can't speak to people unless this is exactly how I feel about this. Outside of that, just go somewhere else.
Right.
And in young minds who have a mentor that really care about them, that you're willing to put time and energy toward that, to work unpaid, and then to just say like, I don't like what you just said, and you need to leave. Like that's that's controlling. That's like the colonizer mindset, that's 101 right there. So again, derailing, but just it's just the thoughts I'm having. It's just it can be haven't we learned biodiversity is the way?
Yeah.
We need for other types of seeds to be planted in this world. The perspectives cannot all be West Michigan based.
Absolutely.
We have to have a worldly understanding of how people operate. Otherwise, it can become very detrimental to an entire community, society, system.
Most definitely. So I would say that maybe the next thing is that people I met through Aquinas, some of them were classmates, and some people who were just involved in the organizing work we were doing on campus. We were talking about getting a place to live together, right? So we were in the process of purchasing a house collectively in the area of southeast part of Grand Rapids, where there's right by Wealthy, and it was on LaGrave Street, right?
Okay.
And a part of this, of course, at the time, I didn't know that was part of the city where the '67 riots had taken place,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So it had been significantly depopulated. Houses were burned during the riots. But we were in the process of getting a house there, which was what had been previously owned by a collective of artists.
Oh.
It was called the Rainbow House when they were living there. So, but in the meantime, I was part of a campaign that my brother was involved in, which, and so this was the first time I did civil disobedience. And it was at a nuclear weapons manufacturing facility in southeast Michigan called Williams International in Walled Lake, Michigan. And they made guidance systems for the cruise missile, which at that time, again, nuclear issues were at the forefront, nuclear weapons issues at the forefront, and cruise missiles were the kinds of missiles that weren't just like launched and did that. They flew along the terrain, so they were able to avoid a lot of radar detection, which made them even more dangerous because people would not have as much time to make decisions about whether or not to respond to it, or all that kinds of things. So I got arrested for basically blocking the entrance with a bunch of other people to prevent people from making more components, right? And we went to court, and the district judge basically just slapped us with a little fine, which we all refused to pay, and then he just said, all right, we could just get out of here, right? So, we left. But then the lawyers for the company had been working with the circuit court judges to try to work on a process to prevent people from continuing to do civil disobedience there. So they basically brought us back into circuit court, and said that this violated an injunction that we had on the place, saying that anybody who was doing civil disobedience at this facility, that we're going to now impose a different kind of a sentence on you, which was basically binding our conscience. So the judge says, look, if you're free to go, but only if you sign a document stating that you will never come back again and do this. And we're saying, like, you can't sentence me to something that I haven't done yet.
That's ridiculous.
Right?
Well, they knew what you were doing.
Of course. So
the judge was like slap on the wrist, but the actual corporation was like, we know exactly what you're trying to accomplish here.
The circuit court judge's cooperation, who was ex-military and everything, so he was all in favor of this whole thing. So so none of us signed the document, and so we went to jail. And we went to jail not like for a certain amount of time. We were there indefinitely until we signed the document.
No way. That sounds so illegal.
That's being held hostage.
It was, all right? So, and what we realized early on is that because they were binding our conscience, is that we were no longer we weren't in jail because of something we had done, but because of something that we may do in the future, that we were technically political prisoners. So Amnesty International got involved in our case, as well as the editor of the Flint Journal at the time, who people didn't know then, Michael Moore, before he became
that sounds so
nationally
familiar.
famous, right?
Yeah, he's the one that did the documentary Where to Invade Next.
Yeah, he's done all the Bowling for Columbine,
That's crazy that he's local.
all this. So he's from Flint, Michigan. That's where he grew up, right? So he used to do a newspaper there. So he came to interview us, even though most of us didn't know who he was at the time, right? Because this is before he made his first documentary, which was called Roger and Me, which is how GM basically gutted Flint when they moved all their factories out of the city, right?
Where he started his radical moment,
right, exactly. So between his interview and that publication and the fact that Amnesty International was now labeling us as political prisoners, and that became news, the company finally decided to drop the charges.
Yeah, it's bad PR.
Because it was bad PR for sure. But this was after, so I got out after 48 days. So I spent 48 days.
Wow,
in there.
That's a long time.
It was was that like in a county jail?
It was in county jail, right? Okay. We were arrested by the Wayne County Sheriff's Department and put in the Wayne County Jail, right?
They didn't book you though, did they? You went through the whole process and you were just like wake up every day. This
Absolutely.
is where you get your meal. This is the process.
Right.
You're going
right. And so they stuck me in a cell, a 6-person cell. They stuck me in a cell with 5 African American men, thinking that here's this young white guy. We're going to scare the bejesus out of you,
right?
Kind of thing. So, and they were sizing me up, like to try to figure out like what was going on, kind of thing. And then when the first meals came, they slide them through the little slot there, and I was like, I'm not eating. Does somebody want my food? And of course they're like, yeah, I'll take it, kind of thing. And then of course, 10 minutes later, they're like, well, why are you not eating? I said, well, I'm fasting, as a protest. And protest for what? And then I told them why I was in jail, and they're like, man, you a crazy white boy.
You're not just like, I hurt somebody.
Knew that you were going to come to jail. I said, yeah, and for these reasons. And then it was just like, then they were good with me. They were like, oh, yeah. Okay.
Respect,
we're
right.
Like, okay, all right.
Yeah.
All right. Plus, then we decided to do some organizing in the jail.
Yeah, of course. They
They
made a mistake.
We were bringing all these lawyers who would help with cases of the folks who were in cells with us. Mostly ACLU lawyers who were doing stuff pro bono for them. And then we had a whole cadre of people who would just come and visit with these inmates because many of them didn't have people who were visiting them. So they were just like, so they were, doing solidarity work, right? In the jail, right? With,
what you do
with people who are
from the church to the jail to the
who are being impacted by mass incarceration, right? So that was another, incredible sort of radicalizing moment for me, just like going through the whole thing of being arrested and then in that sort of political, the prison system, and then just, the experience of like, being in jail for 48 days kind of
just held, right? Like you're not in jail because you've been charged with anything, because like it's just they're holding you until you do what they want. No, they charged us with stuff.
They charged us with stuff. It was a misdemeanor infraction, but because failure to sign the document, right?
Right. That was the misdemeanor. Was that you were not signing a document.
Correct.
That they wanted you to sign.
That makes me so mad.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's not only mad, like, who else is experiencing this? Who else is experiencing something along these lines?
Right.
Yeah.
Whether it be like, we don't like what you're going to do, this is a political thing, or it's just a technical...
Yeah.
And, somebody got pulled over and now they're in this situation like this or something like that. These systems are so frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I eventually get out, and then and of course my friends had already acquired this other house, right? That was in process, right? So I was able to move into this new house that we had collectively purchased, and making the adjustment, but then living in a community was great, because throughout most of the years that we lived there, because we had like a $200 a month mortgage payment.
Yeah. Okay.
Because the house we bought was for $24,000.
Yeah.
My water bill is
$1984, right?
What on
and
earth?
Then so we had that, and there were like 8 of us. So between that and utilities and food, then we never paid more than $100 a month. But in the early years, we paid only $50 a month or $75,
right?
Like into the,
the
the 90s or the 2000s even, and it was only at the latter end it was up to 100. But that was only because of utility increases, whatever. So this allowed all of us to spend more time doing things that we wanted to do, which was, you know, growing our own food,
Community
you know, that
work.
kind of stuff. Or, you know, there were several people who were artists, so they had more time to work on their art because they weren't at a job somewhere doing X, Y, and Z.
Volunteer, do whatever you want.
And to do organizing work.
That sounds so liberating. I feel like if we had something like that today, like it would change. It would really change like the way we work as like a country. But anyway.
Yeah.
Ah.
I mean, I always
Making me dream.
I think just like really encourage folks to consider doing that kind of thing. I mean,
Yeah,
obviously
but also living with 7 other people.
right, you have to give something up. Clearly, it was a big
tough,
old house,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
we, you know, but and plus we used 2 rooms for hospitality for people
Yeah.
who were. So it was those kinds of experiences of living in a collective, doing the radical hospitality, then becoming a sanctuary for political refugees from Guatemala. All those kinds of things kept, you know, being lived experiences that were like very transformative, right?
presenting themselves to you
right,
as well.
Because we were
right?
sort of saying as a group that we, you know, this idea of direct action is different than trying to just appeal to people in power, right? You know, there's that old Quaker adage, you know, like speaking truth to power, whatever. It's like, well, power really doesn't give a shit. Because if that person does listen to you, they're going to probably be replaced by somebody else, right?
Right.
So the point for us was always, and this is also, I grew into embracing an anarchist political philosophy, which was basically believing that not trying to appeal to somebody else to change circumstances, but you create the changes, that you create structures that reflect a world view in which you want to live in, right?
Right.
So we worked by consensus. We said we're going to take people who are unhoused. We took in political refugees. We grew our own food. We do all these kinds of things to try to maybe influence people that way. Plus, it also liberated us as individuals
Of
to be able to
course,
do kind
naturally.
of whatever we wanted to. So I was able to travel to Central America for months at a time to do the work because I didn't have like any real financial commitments while I was
Yeah.
gone because the other people who were there would pick up the slack of
Paying $50 a month
right
to be there.
kinds of things.
Yeah.
So all that stuff was again kind of like an ongoing thing, and then being in a neighborhood where the house was, where we were the only, and not all of us were white, but most of us were white, in a neighborhood that was predominantly black and Latino.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And basically, the way I always sort of saw it is that whatever I learned at Aquinas in whatever social work or sociology classes was just bullshit.
Yeah.
This was my
Experience.
learning right here was what was happening in this neighborhood to these families. The systemic racism that occurred on a regular basis, and all kinds of other things, right?
Right.
It's not just something that someone says,
Right.
right? It's a real,
Right.
true, lived experience.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, right? And you know that neighborhood at the time was like a, you know, it was interesting because
It's not Wealthy Street
so
today.
there certainly, yeah, right, no. So there was a fair amount of street drug dealing going on. There was a fair amount of people working in the sex workers, right? And again, our approach is that we were not going to like call the cops because we don't want to criminalize people for doing
Yeah.
something for whatever reasons that they were, but
Yeah.
sort of none of my business really. But to figure out other ways of responding. So, like with the sex workers, what we were doing is that first of all we always let them know that like, look, if you ever feel unsafe, you come on our porch
Yeah,
if we're not there, and if we're there,
right.
just knock on the door. We'll let you in. You can come in our house, like, 'cause if you don't feel safe. And so that was like kind of like a good sort of foot in the door sort of experience. And then what we started doing is that we started posting signs on telephone poles in the neighborhood that basically telling the people who were looking for sex, right, that we're taking down your license plate number. We're monitoring you. So we were targeting that end of it, right? And we would always say to the folks who were out there, like, look, we're not wanting to negatively impact your ability to
Do what you need to do.
do what you need to do. We're
Right.
saying is that the problem is not you. The problem is these business people and pastors and other folks that we've come to find out were the ones who were coming, because we were then able to like look up records of the men who were Johns who were picking up, and that's who they were. It's like nobody who lived in the neighborhood was doing this kind of thing. And then always offering, like, again, not only a safe place to come, but also like if you wanted to get out of this and do something else, that we had a network of people who would say, like, yes, we'll put you up, we'll provide whatever stuff, whether it's if there's any issues around, you know, detoxing or just, you know, job training or whatever you want to do on your timeline. That's another option. So it was, again, kind of like a, you know, again, this the neighborhood was sort of the classroom, if you will, right? That's where we learned like how to deal with like systemic problems.
That's real life.
As opposed to just like, again, just talking about it or thinking about it.
Well, things like drugs and you know, sex work, right? Like things like those. That is a reaction to something, right? Like no one just woke up one day and decided like, I'm going to be a sex worker, or maybe they did, you know, but like most people don't take that journey to get there. It is,
I mean, the ones that do, I feel usually think of it as a more like kind of maybe glamorous pursuit, for lack of a better word.
Empowering,
empowering. But nobody
I would
wants
say
to be
on
like,
like on the streets though, like selling drugs or like feeling like you have to sell parts of your body, that typically is a reaction to something. It's a survival technique. It's not necessarily like something that they see as glamorous either. So, you know, it's just it's great to give an alternative instead of just telling someone you shouldn't be doing this. Because maybe they know that, or maybe they don't think that. And that just can't be the way to do it. And then also interesting, the list of people you started gathering there. Is it not, no matter where the story is told, is it not the same list of people? Business people and religious leaders. Yes.
Police officers too.
Cops.
What a shitty little story that is.
Right.
I hate those. Sorry. Again, derailing. So,
no.
So, but you learned from being in this, you know, this very real experience.
Yeah, for sure. And then maybe just one last thing which is, I think, more relevant to our larger conversation today, is that because I was part of the Central American Solidarity Movement, a friend of mine and I decided to start doing a study of the Grand Rapids Press coverage of Central America. We did one in 1988. We did another one in 1990 for the whole year to see like what the sources were, what the biases were. You know, all those kinds of things. And that was very instructive, again, about how, as I said at the beginning, how media is constructed and whose voices we get to hear or don't hear, all those kinds of things. So after the study we did in 1990, we had actually printed it up in like a newsprint format, and we took a copy we sent a copy to the editor of the Grand Rapids Press, who then we were able to set up a meeting with him, and we showed up and we walked in the door, and before we were getting ready to sit down, and he said, "Don't bother sitting down." And we said, "Did you get a copy of our report?" And he grabbed it off his desk and he held it up in his left hand, and he said, "This is why your report," and he dropped it in the trash, and he says, "Now get the hell out of my office," kind of thing.
Rude.
So rude.
So even though we thought it was like, you know, well documented, our methodology was very sound.
Put time and energy
all
into
that kind of
that.
stuff, right? You know, to spend a whole year looking at the coverage, you know, was you know, some investment, right? So that experience led us to both like, okay, so we're not going to be able to influence the commercial media. We'll just start our own media. So we started a newspaper. And then a few months later, I started doing a TV show on GRTV, which was also kind of a independent news or news deconstruction show called Days of Our Lies, which was great.
Can we still find that anywhere?
You might be able to. You could probably check with Ted to see if there are any archives.
Ted
here at GRTV, if there are any archives of that. I know a friend of mine who actually was on the show a few times, who lives in Chicago now and does a lot of media work. He actually he claims to have, I've never seen it in person, but he claims to have taped every episode that we did for the 6 years.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And he sent me some digital because he's been slowly digitizing. He sent me some of the digital versions of some of the
Okay.
shows.
That's
which was
You got to
kind
get
of-
those on YouTube
kind of
or
fun,
something like that,
Uh,
you know?
So, yeah, I mean,
Keep it alive.
so just doing that kind of work then led to then me coming to work at the Community Media Center and being the director of what was called the Grand Rapids Institute for Information Democracy, or GRID, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I worked here from 1998 till 2006. Well, I worked for the Media Center. In 2004, my department, as well as some other folks, moved over to the Wealthy Theater because the Media
Okay,
Center had
yeah.
acquired the Wealthy Theater
Yep.
at that time. So my office was over there for a couple of years. And we were doing, besides doing the media literacy, media monitoring stuff, we were also organizing events in the theater, doing a lot of documentaries, that people weren't being exposed to, et cetera. But I left at the end of 2006. We parted ways because the Media Center was not really terribly supportive of what we were doing. We actually had done a radio show on WYC from 2003 till 2006 called Catalyst Radio, which was basically a way of taking some of what we were doing with GRID, the media monitoring stuff, and putting that into a radio show, as well as providing some alternative views or alternative media sources. And then we would usually interview a guest. It was like a 15-minute interview. They weren't really long, but 15-minute interview with a guest of people who were involved in like organizing work in Grand Rapids. Right?
Was it called organizing work back then too? Because
Yeah.
I feel like, okay. Cause
I mean,
was
that's
like,
what
I feel
we always called it, organizing work, right? You know?
Okay. Yeah. I was just wondering because I didn't hear the word until I got offered this job. So.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think people often refer to what maybe we do as activism, and it's not necessarily inaccurate. It's just, it's not a complete term, right?
Yeah.
It's not, I mean, activists can do things just by saying like, okay, I'm not going to buy Domino's Pizza because I don't want to support a company that, you know,
They're on my boycott list now.
whatever, or I choose to bike as a means of communication or transportation or whatever. I mean, that's a personal
Or even
choice. And
showing up to a rally. That could be activism versus like organizing the rally.
Correct. So organizing is different in that sense because it's more difficult, and it means you have to also work with other people to make decisions and choose to do things, and then it's much harder. I mean I'm of the belief that of all the work I've ever done, and I've worked with people with closed head injuries, I've worked in warehouses, I've done a whole range of different kinds of jobs, but I would say that organizing work is the hardest work to do because most of us aren't formally trained as organizers, right? We don't go to school for that kind of thing.
No.
And we're also not
didn't.
we're not only trying to like organize things that we want to do or causes that we care about deeply, we're also having to deal with not only people whose people who have to also unlearn all the
That's
stuff that we've
true,
been
yeah.
taught for our
All
lives,
these narratives
which
that they carry.
you're always pushing back, and then the systems of power, which is even worse. That when there's all that pushback against anything, especially if you're really challenging sort of the dominant narratives kind of thing. So, and you don't always see the fruits of your labor, right? I mean, if I'm
Absolutely.
when I worked in, as a direct care person, it's like. If I'm assisting somebody, give them a bath or do whatever, I see the outcome of what I do, and I'm glad that this person feels refreshed, and it's very satisfying, right? But if you do organizing work, sometimes it takes a while for you to see the fruits of your labor necessarily, and maybe sometimes you never do in certain ways because it won't happen because the person that you've impacted, they don't interact with you again, or the campaign you're working on, maybe it takes so it's always a little more difficult in that regards because you're having to deal with multiple facets of around the issue that you're working on. It's not just a simple like, okay, if I just let people know that this is happening, well then of course they'll make the right decision and they'll do
It's
what
like
we're
where
asking
are they
people
at?
to do, right? Kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, no, it doesn't happen that simply, right? I mean,
No.
it's very, very complex. So, so So I've been doing a lot of media work since that whole thing of doing
Yeah.
the research back in the late 80s. And media, for me, has just become kind of a natural things and recognizing. So I've always tried to include it in the organizing work that I do. And I think that it's important, at least from my perspective, because I didn't see myself ever really as a media person. I saw myself always as an organizer.
Yeah.
I was just using media as a mechanism, or media literacy as a tool
Yeah.
to do my
Kind of for,
organizing more
information
effectively,
dissemination.
right?
Yeah.
So I think for me, it's ever since then I really, which is why the work I'm doing now with Urban Core Collective is that to sort of and maybe amplify the good work that you all are doing through the Urban Core Collective, is by taking in consideration like how public opinions are being molded by the news media around the issues that you're working on,
Yeah.
and how we can create counter narratives to that to try to address those issues, and recognizing that, you know, people aren't just coming at these things neutrally, right? They've
Right.
been constantly bombarded by images and messages that are contrary to what we often will say or what we're presenting to them.
Yeah. And something maybe we can talk about a little bit, because I think this is a great point to pick up, you know, like the lack of coverage in comparison to something like police involvement, right? Like, oh, this violent thing happened, this car accident happened, you know, something that might just seem like your everyday. And then comparison, I don't know if you have the numbers with you. Yeah, I'm assuming that's what that is. So yeah, can you show us some of the comparisons between like how climate is talked about in the news versus other things? And then, you know, off the top, how we said that narrative in the information that's being formatted is of a bias. And then how you might see that connecting to what people care about today.
Absolutely, yeah. So I've been, since January 1st, I've been methodically monitoring MLive, Wood TV 8, WZZ13, and Channel 17, since those are the 4 daily news outlets, primary news outlets, right?
Yep.
There's really no other real news outlets that exist on a daily basis that has that much, devotes that much resources to reporting on local issues, right? So I've been tracking the issues that Urban Core Collective works on, right, which is climate change, climate justice, local elections, local democracy, public safety and policing, and then public education. Those are the 4 areas I've been looking at.
Yeah.
And it's been interesting that collectively, if just with looking at the numbers, so we're into June now, so we're, you know,
Half a day.
five, you know, almost 5.5 months into the monitoring work. And when it comes of those 4 areas, the least coverage is with climate change.
Yeah.
So there's a total of 20 stories, you know, from all those 4 news sources,
yeah.
20 stories in total. MLive has the most. They have 13. The TV stations have 2, 2, and 3, right? The next lowest is local democracy or local elections kinds of stuff, right?
It's like your county commissioner.
Which you would think
county
that would
and
be
city
bigger
commissioner,
stories
school,
there.
you know,
School board,
school
yeah.
board. Well, not school board
no,
because that's
okay.
under public education, but you know,
Okay,
just
okay.
city and county stuff like that. So there's only been 25 stories total since January 1st. Public education has received more. That's up to 60,
Okay, yeah.
with all 4 news outlets being in the teens of, you know, coverage. But the area that has most is public safety or policing, right? So there's been 270 stories
Yeah.
around
Wow,
that.
it's like magnitudes bigger than all the other ones.
Yes.
Well, not only
Way
that,
bigger.
how many days is half a year? That's what, 180-ish days or so is half a year. That's
Right.
well over a story a day.
Right.
You know, when you
That's-
think
yeah,
about
when you
it
think
in
about it
that
that
way,
way.
it's just that's what they're reporting on.
Right. So again, these are all deliberate decisions that they make based upon the news releases that they get from people in the community, organizations in the community, to what's most expedient. You know, crime coverage is some of the easiest coverage to do because
course.
the police are the source. you show up, there's flashing lights, there's police tape.
Yeah.
The narrative is already created for you because they're only reporting on it as a crime, not as anything else. They're not like asking questions about why this stuff has happened.
Right.
They're not treating it as a public health issue. They're treating it just purely as a crime issue. Right?
Yeah.
So it's the old adage that if it bleeds, it leads kind of thing is
Yeah.
within news agencies, right?
Of course.
I've never heard of it before, but that sounds so extractive.
What about the bleeding climate?
Right.
What about our
Right.
bleeding environments?
Right.
You know, I mean, it's harder to see.
Yeah. Well, and on that matter, so with climate change, right, obviously, it requires a little more thought, right, for a variety of reasons. So let's just start with the fact that there are plenty of organizations, there are plenty of people, even people in power, who deny that climate change even exists, right?
Yep.
Right? There's all these climate deniers, right? You have groups like the Heartland Institute. You have fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil that actually spend money
Yeah.
giving away, millions of dollars to think tanks to help them promote this idea that climate scientists are lunatics and
smear
it's not true
campaign,
and all
yeah.
that sort of stuff,
Yep,
right? So
yep.
an example would be locally is that ExxonMobil, since the late 90s, has given the Acton Institute here in Grand Rapids, which is a think tank. It's a,
What is it called? The Atkins Assistant?
Acton, Acton, Acton Institute for
Okay.
the Study of Religion and Liberty, right? They're an organization that believes that capitalism and Christianity are great bedfellows. And so they've received...
Which is so ironic to me because if
Yeah.
you read the Bible, like Jesus was totally a commie, but that's a topic for another
Yeah. So
That's what this episode's going to be
So
called.
they've-
Jesus was a commie.
they've received hundreds of thousands of dollars to basically promote that climate change is not real.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right?
Hey,
Right here in
I was
Grand
here-
Rapids, right? So that, what they do, right?
Okay.
So there's that,
Yes.
right? Part of it, right? Where there's all these, organizations and entities, politicians, et cetera, that deny that it exists. So
Yeah.
that's one component to it, right? But I think a bigger one is, in many ways, and maybe in a more insidious one, because that's like, okay, yeah, fossil fuel companies don't want us to think this, so they pay people to tell them.
It's not wild.
Okay, right. It's not.
Right.
It's not. I mean, if your job is to make profits off of extracting and burning fossil fuels, well, of course you want people to not believe
you're
it's a
gonna
problem.
deny climate change.
Right.
Sure.
But the more insidious part of it, in my opinion, is really, and this gets back to the way that news covers it, is that more often than not, when news reports on climate-related issues or weather issues, whether it's, let's say, in the winter months, right? Since I've been doing this study, right? There's been some stories about like tourist businesses or ski lodges or whatever who
Absolutely.
have had to like lay off people because it's been such a mild winter, right?
Yeah.
And okay, yeah, it's a human interest story. Like businesses are hurting or people have lost their jobs because of the fact that their job is centered around seasonal
Yeah.
work, right? Working at a ski lodge or whatever, right? But what's instructive about all that is that none of those stories ever even talks about like why is it a mild winter or I mean and
The
yet,
warmest winter on record.
right. So all the
Yikes.
literally thousands of climate scientists who work together on this, as well as all the organizations that spend an awful lot of energy and constantly, putting out reports. I mean, every month of this year so far, since January 1st, right? Every month of this year in 2024, every month has been the warmest month ever recorded in history.
Yes.
It is
Every
true.
month of 24 has surpassed any previous warm
When
month.
that doesn't scare people, I'm like, oof. Like,
Right.
do
You know, but
really get
somebody
it?
did put it this way once is how are we supposed to explain how bad climate change is when it's producing something that we enjoy, especially here in Michigan. Maybe like in Arizona, they're not enjoying the warmest months of
Right.
the
Right.
years.
Well, I would say one of the ways to explain that is that, like, okay, so yes, I get the whole thing that, like, oh, people prefer warmer weather and
Yeah.
how nice that it's
Mild
not,
winters is
not
not a
so-
bad thing
not,
when you get
kinds
buried
of-
in snow.
Right. But we also need to take in consideration that not having like a typical winter
Yeah,
also has consequences,
of course.
right? I mean, I'm a grower. I'm a
Yeah,
big gardener,
there you
right?
go.
We did
Yeah.
not have a hard freeze this year. which means that all the microorganizations, all the fungus, all those things that did not die, which are necessary for having healthy soil, as well as not having to deal with certain pests, right?
Also, some seeds don't sprout unless they go through that cold period.
Absolutely, right? So all those kinds of things that don't happen, right? Farmers are going to be deeply impacted. Who knows
It's
what
not
the
just
outcome,
a garden, right?
The outcome of the lack of the soil actually freezing, you know, like freezing several inches below the topsoil, right, is necessary in this kind of climate because we have certain things in the soil, microorganisms that need to either be killed off on an annual basis because otherwise if they you know don't,
keep
then
going.
we're gonna have infestations of things, right? As well as just as you mentioned, Nancy, that certain seeds, all that kind of stuff that need to have that as it's just part of a life cycle that nature knows, right?
Yeah.
It's its own internal mechanisms. They know what they need to do, right?
Not to mention like snowmelt, right? And how that like feels like our watershed, like how like that like moisturizes or moistens like our fields and things. Yeah.
Right.
Just like all of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So all that's just a consequence, and again, not talking about it is important, right? Just not how humans are impacted, but by all ecosystems are impacted by this, right? Other life forms are impacted when the planet is warmed, right? At alarming rates, right? So we see that with climate itself, right? We see more severity with climate change, right? Whether it's rain, whether it's an increase in tornadoes, all those kinds of things that historically we don't necessarily experience as much. I mean, we are fortunate to live in the Great Lakes because we have the largest body of fresh water on the planet, right? And an ecosystem that's pretty robust. But it's also being impacted by what's happening, right? So, because you can't keep, doing what we're doing as humans to the planet without there being these kinds of consequences, right?
Depleting it.
Right. So there's all that kind of stuff. And so, of course, in the news coverage, that's not even being talked about.
No.
In fact, of the 20 stories that I've documented that even are sort of climate change related, right? Mostly around weather. Only twice did in any of those news stories they even say the word climate change.
Yeah.
Ooh.
So we're not even going to we're not even going to name that reality.
Yeah, it's like just like the elephant in the room.
Completely avoid it, let alone not even ask the question, never asked any question, well, why is it getting warmer? Why did we have such a mild winter? Why?
It's
right?
just a skate by. It's like, oh, by the way, this is the warmest year it's ever been. See ya. Like, it's not like because the climate is changing, because of our, behavior as humans, because we have, exacerbated this change.
Yeah, I feel like it's being very like this dismissive of a lot of these changes that we're seeing.
Yeah, it totally is gaslighting, is what we would call that.
Absolutely, yeah. and I think the thing about climate issues and the climate justice movement, which I find very exciting in many ways, is that maybe almost more than any other issue, that it's a very intersectional issue, right? We certainly know that BIPOC folks around the planet are the most impacted by climate change, right? So there's that kind of there's that dynamic. We also know that that the economics of climate change, right, of climate crisis is it's difficult to even sort of kind of put a number to like the cost of all that kind of stuff.
Right.
It's much more than just a ski resort.
Absolutely, like and who's ultimately gonna end up paying for it, right? Certainly not the folks who are most responsible for heating the planet.
No, there's tax cuts for that,
all that kind of stuff or whatever, right? The agribusiness systems, all those kinds of things, right? So there's that sort of dynamic, and then there's like, so here we are. The last 2 years of the Biden administration has spent more money on military budget than any previous president has ever spent. So it's up to $886 billion is the federal military budget, right?
It's $1 billion?
this
billion,
war,
886 billion right now.
Yikes.
Now, so, and that, but then they're always allocating additional stuff, right? So they just recently
yeah.
passed another 104 billion to be able to go towards Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel, right?
Yep.
For all that sort of stuff, right? So, and there's great research, done by a variety of groups that really look at sort of the ecological impact of militarism, right? And how militarism and climate change intersect,
they're
right?
synonymous.
So
they are
much.
besties.
But we rarely ever talk about it, right?
Yeah.
And so people who are doing anti-war work, which I'm glad that they're doing that, but too often they don't bring in class, race, ecology
Right.
into the discussion around why the rest of us should care about this stuff, right? It's not just the people who are being killed or whatever. Yeah, that in of itself is pretty horrible, right? But we also have to come to terms with the fact that, like, look, the U.S. military is like the
one of the
eighth largest, I think, consumer of fossil fuels.
It's true.
So more so than most countries do.
Nancy and I did an episode on this. It's called Their War, Our Fight. And we're talking about how beyond all of the things you just named that war is going to bring in general, taking lives, taking infrastructure, creating traumas, there's also this large piece of our defense system emitting an incredible amount, more than we even really can understand, from heating and cooling their facilities to the actual destruction that their vehicles bring to, the
mining
destruction
of the metals that they use. Yeah.
It is,
Right.
the climate is not only changing around our behavior, but it's changing around the implementation of our behavior. How we get these things is really what's changing our climate.
Right.
And so when we talk about war, we do have to talk about those things. It's not just taking lives from the people who are really actually front line, right? This is taking lives from the environment that we all live in currently.
Right.
Even with everything going on with like the genocide, like I've been seeing how a lot of the military forces are going out of their way to destroy these like olive trees that have been around for like hundreds of years, and at that point it's like they're trying to like not just kill the people, but then also they kill their spirit too, because for them, like, their land and their trees and their plants and their fauna, like, all of that is like, so that's home to them.
Absolutely.
Their native connection.
It's their environment. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, all these things are connected, and that's really extremely important. But this is, again, when it comes to how the news frames climate change or climate justice, apart from the fact that they mostly ignore it, but when there are stories that are sort of related to it, there's no digging, there's no explanation, there's no exploration of like what's the significance of all this.
There's no critical thought. Like an AI bot could have spit that out.
Right. And probably done a better job, right, in that regard, right? So that's the thing that I think it's why it's important. And one of the things I'm trying to do with the work I'm doing with UCC is to say, like, it's important that we come to terms with if this is what people are primarily relying on, right? And yes, there are people like yourselves who are thinking about these issues because you care deeply about them, right? But a lot of people, a lot of working class folks,
Don't have the
families
bandwidth.
and whatnot, so just like, I mean, they're not that they're not thinking about it. I'm not trying to say that they don't care and like that stuff, but if you're working long hours, you have kids to take care of, you're just trying to make ends meet or whatever, it's like, it's a luxury to be able to like think about stuff
That's depressing.
that's
Yeah.
in maybe
Outside
a
of
more
the box.
abstract, or at least,
Yeah.
like doesn't directly affect me per se kind of thing, right? Even though it does, but maybe, we've not done a good enough job to like get folks to think about that kind of stuff. But so that's the other thing. So if what they're relying on is the local news, if for any of that kind of information or lack thereof, that's going to have an impact on how they perceive issues or not. So they're inundated with crime stories, which often communicates like, okay, crime is out of control, so we must need more funding for cops. So let's make sure that they're adequately funded and they're adequately staffed, blah, 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 without realizing that most of the stories that rely on the GRPD about something that has happened, the GRPD is not doing anything. They show up after the fact something happened. So they're not doing any prevention.
It's a reaction.
No, yeah, they're just cleaning up after.
Right? So it's like they don't prevent crime. So what is it exactly that they're doing to keep us safe, right?
I live on Franklin and Eastern, and I know what they're doing. Right. They're in groups, just pulling 3 cop cars, pulling one person over. That's what they're doing.
Right.
They're profiling people, and when they do it in abundance, all of them at once. Yeah. And it's just so incredibly frustrating.
Right.
You know, because the reality is you are not going to stop something from happening unless you address the reason why it happened in the first place.
Yeah.
Totally.
There's not enough Supermans in the world to stop the purses from being snatched. Like, why was the purse snatched? That's what we need to be talking about.
Yeah,
right?
It's like, was he hungry?
Exactly.
Is there medical bills? Like, yeah, there's always something else going on.
Exactly. There's just like an underlying thing.
Yeah. So, and you have that lived experience because of where you live and because who you are and all those kinds of things. You have this lived experience, right? But for people who disproportionately consume Wood TV8 or whatever, right? You know, we're talking about people who live in Comstock Park or live in Ionia or Holland or whatever kind of thing. They're thinking like, I'm not going to Grand Rapids because it's dangerous, especially in that third ward or whatever. Like there's, you see all these black and brown people faces in these news stories, and you're thinking like, shit, I should stay away from those people or these neighborhoods or whatever, right? So it sort of inherently nurtures a sense that things are more dangerous than they are. It nurtures a white supremacist worldview. It nurtures all these dynamics, which are just untrue because these are constructed news stories that have nothing to do with what's actually happening in these communities, right? Especially when they don't address root causes of problems.
They're seeing a moment in the neighborhood, in a space. And then they get an entire narrative of who everybody is that lives in that area.
And like Adrienne Marie Brown says, we're living in a battle of imaginations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, if you just look at the new amphitheater that's being built, right? And now they're proposing building a walkable bridge to connect from William Street by where the amphitheater is going to be to Front Street on the other side of the river, which is really all about
walkability.
It's really providing an opportunity for people who are going to have to be, because they're not building any parking structures for this amphitheater, right? I mean, it's a 14,000 seat space. Like,
I didn't realize there was no parking structures.
We don't have
no parking structures are built.
We don't have.
They're not adding anything new.
For.
So my contention is that the walkable bridge is really being built so that people who will park on the west side of the river can then walk over to the amphitheater events, which is also going to impact people who live on the west side, near west side, who are going to be inundated with more and more cars, particularly in evening events when most concerts will take place, which are going to, in of itself, create a whole bunch of problems. But it also, again, they're not addressing any structural stuff. It's certainly not addressing the fact that we disproportionately rely on single car occupancy for motorization that is just the stupidest thing on the planet.
Let's talk about it. We're going to put a $300 million amphitheater in, but we can't get any high-speed rails or a better busing system.
Right.
What is the priority?
Right.
And who are we attempting to get into these spaces? The people who need to do something like walk, bike, or ride public transportation to those spaces? Or is it just the people, to your point, who are going to drive their single occupant vehicles so that they can come to Grand Rapids for the night, do their, playground stuff, and then go back out to either the Caledonias, the Adas with their opinions and their preconceived notions.
Right. And I just posted a piece yesterday.
This amphitheater is really pissing me off.
On the Grid blog, making that point and saying that, why, and asking the question, why is it that they can always find so much money for things that are based in, and I have nothing against like a concert venue inherently, right? It's like, I like music, live
fun.
Music as well as anybody else. Not that we don't already have a plethora of places that people can go hear music.
We do.
The problem is the whole idea that they think that bigger is better, and it's not. I'd rather sit in a much more intimate space to hear live music than be...
If you know, you know.
All those kinds of things, right?
Like the Voss is like a great place for concerts, but it's also so big and there's seats, so it's like you can't even really like distance. Like you're just sitting there.
That was one of the
Half a
first
mile
places I
away.
ever went into the nosebleeds was Van Andel. I was like, wow, this is a concert, but you're up here. You
Right.
Yeah,
know, I was a kid.
Yeah, I would say definitely smaller is better. Like I prefer
Yeah.
shows at the pyramid scheme over
Right, exactly.
Van Andel for yeah.
And again, the point of the blog post is really to say, like, okay, so we're able to somehow, and again, a lot of this is public money that's funding these things, which is privately owned, right? And you're sort of like the question I ask in the article is that, okay, how comes they can find, hundreds of millions of dollars to put in an amphitheater, but they can't spend that same amount of money and invest in the third ward?
Yeah.
They can't find the same amount of money to provide support to renters in a housing crisis. You can't find the same amount of money to help
Fix the
families
lead
who are
issue.
experiencing
Yeah.
food insecurity. Or what, I mean, all
Yeah.
these things that are like really critical for people. And Grand Rapids likes to claim that we care about its residents.
Yeah.
When you're just kind of perpetuating the same dynamic where you're getting the public to pay for
Private
interests that are proposed by private interests, in this case Grand Action 2.0, which again we all know who runs those things. It's the Rosses and all the other sort of members of the Grand Rapids power structure. So and they make these decisions with our tax money, and we have no say in it, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Also, by the way, Grand Rapids has a population of under 200,000 people. You could give $1,000 to $10,000 to each individual in Grand Rapids to help them with that amount of money. Like these are the types of things where I just think about like, what are we really putting our resources toward, and who is it helping, right? Who is being assisted? I mean, even who is going to be contracted to build this amphitheater? Who's going to make money off of it, right? I mean, I promise the $15 to $20 an hour they're going to market these jobs at for people are not going to be what takes them out of the space that they're in.
Right.
I mean, is the amphitheater planning on paying people a livable wage, which is now $30+ an hour?
I mean, the low income National Income Housing Assistance Coalition basically is saying that in Grand Rapids, the average rent, to afford the average rent, you need to make $25.50 an hour
Yes.
to be able to afford the average rent. Now that's not necessarily a livable wage. That's to be able to afford the average rent. So
A third of your
depending
income.
on whatever else you want to do with your life, right? That comes along with paying rent.
Like eating,
Being a person.
paying
Right.
consumers or DTE.
Having some money to do leisurely things,
Totally.
right? Whatever that might be. Pay off student debt or whatever, right? All that
Travel.
kind of stuff, right?
Enjoy your life.
Right. So yeah, no, it's not livable, and again they keep perpetuating this stuff. And part of the reason why I monitor the stuff and write about this stuff on a regular basis is because I think it's important that we normalize a critical look at how these systems keep functioning if we're going to ever break through to actually have a citizenry that will actually oppose and resist this kind of stuff being foisted on them, right? Because first of all, people mostly don't know, or at least don't know the details, right?
Yeah.
And then having the energy or the wherewithal to like figure out how to oppose it or to counteract that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
It's a whole other thing. So I mean, again, for me, that's why media work is important. Critical thinking about media is important for the organizing work we do, because we have to figure out ways to create robust counter narratives to challenge, what the systems of power are imposing on the rest of us, right?
For sure.
It's like I'm picturing like an MRI. You're a doctor, and you're scanning the system. You're scanning this person for what is the problem, right? And then once you figure out what it is, okay, now how do we diagnose this? If improper coverage on media is what's misinforming people, what can we do to counteract this? What can we do to remedy this problem that's causing our systems to fail us?
Yeah.
So
the MRI example is a great one, I think, because the person who's looking at it is somebody who's had years of training.
Yes,
right?
right.
They've spent
we trust him.
hundreds of thousands
Right,
of
we trust
dollars
this
for
person.
education to go to school for 8-10 years to learn this stuff, right? So they're an expert, right, in their field, right? So they are reading this MRI because they have the knowledge and the background
Yes.
to like adequately assess what's going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm a big fan of linguist, political writer Noam Chomsky, right, who's done a lot of media work. And one of his statement he would make all the time, and much of his writing is that our actions will always be inadequate if our analysis is inadequate, right? We have to have a really robust analysis, not necessarily before we take action, because you do something, you take action, you reflect on it, and you maybe try to sharpen the analysis, and then you take more action, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, that's a critical, that's an important point, because, if we're thinking in very sort of superficial ways of addressing problems, our actions are going to be inadequate, because we're not investing enough energy of trying to look at these issues from a very critical intersectional lens to sort of say, like, okay, what's the real meaning of all this stuff, and how do we really address it, right? Disproportionately, it's always like, oh, like with the climate crisis, right? So the business community always comes up with real winners, right? We're gonna engage in carbon capturing, right? It's not addressing the root cause of the problem. It just means you're temporarily trying to contain carbon somewhere.
Yeah, this is bad, but we can do something with it.
Right? No, because they don't want to really think about the ideas that really, like, bigger is not better. Growth is not. Constant growth is not really better. It's not sustainable. It's all those things, right?
But the main thing is constant change that we need.
Right. And so we're always hearing over and over again, whether it's the mayor of Grand Rapids or whoever else might be, would say that, like, our whole goal with all these projects, all these so-called transformational projects downtown, is to grow Grand Rapids. Well,
to grow pockets of business owners.
Right, exactly. So there's a certain percentage of people who will benefit tremendously, but the majority of the population is not benefiting from these dynamics.
No.
And why would you want to have more people come live here when we're not even making sure that 25, 30, 40% of people, and again, it varies within, racial lines or whatnot, that those people who live in the city do not have their needs met and not are given the resources, the same kinds of investments in their communities to make them to have healthy, thriving families. Kinds of things,
not to mention the lack of inclusivity and diversity, right? Like, we're not really even mentally prepared to invite all of the different cultures that are going to be entering our space, especially with the Great Lakes and, the climate refugees that we're going to be seeing here in the next, 10 years or so. Yeah.
I have one more question, though. It's kind of just, like, related to media, and I just want to kind of maybe just see what your thoughts are, like, on social media. I was talking with one of my friends about how... like, in a way, even though social media is owned by corporations, and a lot of the algorithms are influenced by, like, the corporates, like, interests and things like that, depending on, like, what actually crosses your feed. At the end of the day, like, we're having this genocide being streamed, like, real time, right? Like, it's being documented real time and being put out there. And then, so media, like, social media can be a form of kind of, like, individual, like, journalism, or I don't know how you want to think of it, like, guerrilla journalism. And the way, like, it might speak to truth more than, like, corporate media because it's being done by the people. So I was just kind of wondering what your thoughts are on social media as a form of journalism, for lack of a better word.
I mean, I think that, it's obviously problematic that Zuckerberg owns Facebook, and it's problematic that Musk owns X, and all this. It's just deeply problematic. Like, most of our media is owned by a concentration of really of billionaires, right? That's sort of inherently problematic. So it's always good that we can figure out ways to create media like what you all are doing that is not owned by large corporations or whatever. It's right. It's like you're using the resources of a community-based media entity here in town, and you're posting it on, whatever platforms you choose to post it on, right?
Zero sponsorship. Like, this is a once a year, pay the fee. Our, Urban Core Collective helped us do this, but otherwise, yeah, we're not
Yeah.
paid to say something specific. Nobody is putting a cap on what we're going to say or telling us to say anything in particular.
Right. So, but to your point, Nancy, I think that certainly people who are, the journalists who are on the ground in Gaza and documenting stuff, many of them at the cost of their own lives, right? It's important that stuff is being documented and it's being streamed and people are accessing it through social media and people are sharing it through social media, all those things. I mean, that's all good, right? Because awareness is, part of the equation if we want to create change. But certainly, I think in our culture, in U.S. culture, right, we are inundated with media messaging.
Yeah.
So much, right? I almost think that at some level there's a certain numbness that comes to with it, like, I don't want to look at that stuff.
Yeah.
I know it's happening. I just can't do it. I mean, whatever. I get it all, that sort of stuff. I think for me, what's really important in the long run, and this is not to discredit or minimize the importance of people utilizing social media to get out critical narratives about what's happening in the world, right?
Yeah.
Like what's happening in Gaza, right? But I think the more important thing is, the more important question we need to be asking ourselves is not so much whether, social media is, the greatest, thing since sliced bread, is more like, then with this information, with this narrative, this video, whatever we're seeing, what's happening. We know what's happening. We know it's a genocide. It's being called a genocide, right? Even the international courts are calling it genocide. How do we address that in meaningful ways that dismantles the ability of the Israeli government to continue the genocide, right? And that's being done by what campus protests were doing, which was not just occupying physical spaces with the protests in the tent cities. It's calling for their universities to divest from Israel.
I like that there was like a concrete ask with that.
Right. So the divestment was the primary sort of thing. It means mobilizing people to pressure, local, state, and federal governments to not support that. It means targeting weapons manufacturers that are their weapons are being utilized in Israel by the Israeli military to bomb innocent Palestinians. I mean, it's a multi-pronged kind of thing that we need to address. But for me, ultimately, those are the big questions, because we can see as much messaging as we want, but if it never moves us to then ask the question, how do we actually address the problem? How do we remove the influence of the pro-Israel political action committees like AIPAC in the federal government, who are spending millions of dollars in the current election cycle to prevent pro-Palestine members of Congress from being reelected?
What?
Yeah.
So with what you're saying is, in the age of information, in the age of access, what are we going to do with it?
Yeah.
We can't just allow for it to be this numbing thing that we use to it's like find recipes and share stuff with each other. Like, if we're going to have actual abilities to connect to each other, what then are we going to do to solve the issue?
Right.
We don't want to have to keep seeing destruction and people starving and the unhoused and mental health crises. Like, what is the solution then when we see this problem?
Right.
What are we going to do with the power of social media to alleviate the issues that we're seeing socially?
I mean, again, I think using social media is a component. I think it's a very small component in terms of like actually doing things that will make a difference, right? It's getting organized people to engage in divestment and trying to confront weapons manufacturers and addressing issues around Zionist forces that exist, in our communities, et cetera, how it's in fact impacting, political campaigns, all that kind of stuff, right? And that's to me, that's where social movements happen, when those forces kind of unify at some level, or at least support each other, all those different campaigns to try to reduce and minimize and maybe eliminate the harm, and even then eventually maybe dismantle the systems of oppression that could just as easily start up again if they're left to their own devices, kind of thing, so and that's always the harder work. I mean, that's the sort of the point I was trying to make in many ways in my book, People's History of Grand Rapids, which is why it's really centered on history of social movements in this country. And so you can see where there are flashpoints where a lot of people are mobilized to do something, and that's great, but it has to be for the long haul, right?
Yeah.
Freedom is a constant, right? It's not like you do it every now and then, fight for freedom kind of thing. I'm not to say like we have to spend all waking hours spending on this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and it is important to separate from it, but it doesn't just stop because you want to go enjoy yourself.
Right, because the systems of power and oppression are not taking any time off, right? They're not. They're just not.
Oh,
whatever,
they are
right?
in full swing.
So how do we effectively address that? And I'm a firm believer that, organized people can always trump organized money if we have, a robust analysis, and if we engage in tactics and strategies that will actually dismantle what they're doing, not just
address the cancers, don't just scan for it.
Right.
Yeah,
because I feel like otherwise there's not like a full process for the information that we are taking in, because we're almost just holding it without digesting it, since we can't really do anything about it. And I feel like there's
we flip to the next thing, and it's no longer about destruction. It's about it's a joke, or the content we take in is just very 15-second type stuff.
Or we're just reacting, right? We're just waiting for the next Patrick Leolia to be murdered by the police. And yes, we should react to that. But the problem is not that they killed a certain person. The problem is the system and institution of policing, right? That we need to address what role they play, why they play this role, what their historical function has been, and we need to then really think about what does community safety really look like, because it's not them, not them.
What does my shirt say?
Right, right.
No cops at traffic stops.
Right, yeah.
Just not necessary. It's not that deep, guys.
Right.
I promise. If your authority and potential need for weapon can be used elsewhere, it is not there. Ugh. Anyway, that's a whole other topic.
Yeah.
But what I would like to do is kind of round this conversation up, So what would you leave, and you can choose if it's in the media aspect, if it's within the climate scope, if it's just organizing in general, or solidarity
or
work.
For those of us who haven't found that community yet.
So what would be your call to action, right, for some form of solution to any one of the things we've talked about?
Sure. Well, maybe to address all the things you just mentioned with the call to action. So specifically just around media, I think it's really important that we, start embracing more critical thinking about the media we consume, particularly the news, but all media in some levels, right? To come to terms with how media is constructed, et cetera. And then seek out independent sources of information particularly that are created or generated by more specific sectors, right? So if I want to read something about how mass incarceration is impacting the Black community, I'm not going to rely on Forbes magazine or CNN. I'm going to go read Black Agenda Report, right?
Yes.
Which is a really great online blog, which is people who are very sort of rooted in that, history of the Black freedom struggle, right? It's like, okay, I want your take. I want your analysis of it because you've been at it for a long time.
So vet your sources.
Right. So we need to do that with, I think, whatever it is, right? And with climate, I think one source I would recommend is called DeSmog. Right, desmog.org, right? It's DeSmog blog, right? It's just DESMOG, right? And they provide really robust analysis. They have these great resources on their site to anybody who's taken money from fossil fuel companies to promote climate denial, they have all that information.
Love
right?
that.
You can do a
Okay.
robust research, deep dive into all
Yeah.
that
It's
stuff.
pretty easy
right?
to find that information if you
It
have the
is.
right sources.
It is, right.
But to have it all there, it's
Right.
a lot of time and
That's
energy to
nice.
find it.
So they've done the work to make it easier for the rest of us to sort of like figure those things out, especially if you're trying to find, entities in your own community kind of thing,
Yeah.
right? So that's a great resource, I would say. And then when it comes to like the activism thing, I think, so for me, it's two things, right? One, we need to put the laptop down or the smartphone down or whatever it is kind of media we all spend too much time in front of, and go out and do something outside to find some grounding, and then go find entities and organized people who are trying to address these kinds of issues, right?
Preach.
So for me, the groups that I work with currently primarily are, I work with Comrades Collective, which is addressing policing in this city. I work with Movimiento Cosecha, which is led by undocumented folks who are addressing immigrant justice. I work with the Grand Rapids Area Tenant Union, which is fighting, trying to build tenant power and fight landlords and property management companies that are exploiting them on a daily basis. It's those kinds of groups that I think they're the grassroots, they're autonomous, they're not 501c3s necessarily, they're just folks who are just organized around issues that they deeply care about, and they're primarily organized by people who have that lived experience, right? That's they're not, a bunch of us, they're not young white folks who are thinking like, oh, I read this book by Karl Marx, and so I want to do class-based work. Like, there's nothing wrong with reading Marx, but like, working class people know their reality better than Karl Marx did, right? Because
Of course.
he lived a long time ago, and capitalism is morphed into a whole different animal than when he was around, kind of thing. So I think
He
those
would die
movements.
instantly. Seeing
Of course, right? So I think remove yourself from just all the busyness of the
Stuff.
the neoliberal capitalist world, and just try to ground yourself. And however you do that, for me, it's gardening. I going out and just getting my hands in the soil and being with the plants, and then I go choose to act with people in compassionate, direct action ways to try to make systemic change, right?
So ground yourself.
That's
And
right.
then once you feel like you're you again, go do what compels you to make big changes.
Yeah, and that's not like a one-time thing where I
No,
try to do it on a daily basis. And it's not a question of like, go find yourself, and then, maybe a year from now, you'll once you've found yourself. I don't think
Yeah,
that,
right.
I also
No.
think that's a deeply privileged sort of reality, right? So it's
of
like,
course.
it's a both and, right? I can't be whole unless, the people and the beings around me are whole as well,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So we're intricately tied into each other's well-being, right? So while I'm still always working on myself, I also have to not just focus on myself.
Yeah.
Right?
This is for everyone. For
Right,
me to be
right.
better is for all of us to be
Yeah,
better.
in fact, my liberation as an individual is completely tied up in your liberation. So I have to do these things with it, and I think it's so much more enriching, so much more vibrant, so much more dynamic. And that's been my experience in my short 63 years on this planet. So
And
God damn it, Nancy. All right. Well, thank you so much.
yeah,
Thank
thanks for
you.
your time.
Thank you for your time, your expertise. Something
Just like
I'm
all
really
the experiences like blow my mind.
Yeah, and that's what I was just gonna say that I'm really learning from other people's wisdom lately. We sometimes we just gotta shut up because we don't have the answers. Someone in the room might. Let them say it, and so this is just a space full of insight. And I'm definitely gonna leave here, I think, a different organizer after this conversation with you. So thank you so much.
well, thank you for the opportunity
Yeah.
to have a conversation with you. And thank you for the work you're doing.
It's fun, right? This part is fun. It's creative. It's cool, and
And
we
the
get to
topics
hear
are
from
kind of
people.
heavy, but yeah, the actual
The topics aren't heavy. What are you talking about? This is easy. This is something light.
Rainbows and planet saving.
Yeah, right. We hugged a tree. That was all. Do you want to sign us off?
Sure. So you've been listening to Green Grand Rapids, the best podcast on climate justice in Grand Rapids. And we'll see you next time.
See ya. Peace.